Okay, isValid method. What the problem is here? We obviously have different, we're checking for a different property. Well, what could we do? What could we potentially do with this problem? How can we extract this method back to the notification so that we don't have to have the same method declared twice within two different classes? Well, what we could do, because now we have recipient class, both of these classes, this email recipient and text recipient, what we could do is to specify a method isValid directly on this recipient, and then from within isValid, simply check is it valid. Just delegate the call to the recipient class, the instance of the class. And I'm going to show in just a second how to do it. It may sound a little bit more confusing than it actually is. So say we are going to cut this isValid method and put it, this is for the text, put it within the text class. Okay, so we've got this text recipient now. This, from within this class, we can check whether these properties are not empty. So basically, in other words, whether this instance of the class is valid, is ready to send the text message in this case. Obviously, we cannot have it protected because we will need to have access to this isValid now from outside of this class, so we need to make it public. And now what I can do from within this text class, now we don't have this isValid method, we can go to notification and create the isValid method here and make it protected this time, because we only need to, actually we can even make it private, because this method is not going to be accessed from within the subclasses. We only need access to this method from within the notification, which uses the isValid method from within the send class. Send method. So okay, so we start with a private function isValid, and this time what we're going to do is use this recipient is valid. This is what we're going to return. So return, because we are now delegating this isValid call to the isValid method on the recipient. In this case, when we're going to be working with the text class, it's going to be this text recipient. Obviously, our email recipient doesn't have this method yet, so let's cut it from within the email class and paste it within the email recipient class. And again, let's make it public, and everything else stays exactly the same. So we've got isValid method, which checks whether the name and email isn't empty. If they aren't, that means that this instance of the class is valid and you can send a message using this instance. Okay, so back to the notification. One thing that you probably have noticed, I'm calling this isValid method, but it basically is highlighted by my ID, because this IDE doesn't know that this instance of the whatever instance is associated with this property recipient has this method declared on it. So this is where this abstraction starts coming into play. Let's go to our recipient class, and what I'm going to do here is declare the abstract method. So abstract public function is valid. Now what happens when I add this method to the abstract class? That means that now all of the child classes, in our case email recipient and text recipient, is required to have this method declared here and provide the implementation for this method. When you declare the abstract method, you don't provide the implementation. So you don't provide any code that actually is within this method. You only specify the contract. You tell basically the code, if you extend me, make sure that you have this class, and whatever way you want to do it your way. Make sure that if I don't have any arguments, don't put any arguments. If I have one argument, have one or more arguments, but if you have more than the number of arguments actually declared by the abstract class abstract method definition, they have to have null by default. They have to be optional. And let me just quickly show you what that means. If I just go back to the email recipient, and I'm going to comment this isValid method for time being, and as you can see, my IDE automatically highlights it. Tells me the class must be declared abstract or implement isValid method, because that's what this recipient abstract class requires us to actually have. So I'm going to add this method stub this time. It's only an empty method, as you can see. I'm creating again an isValid method, but what I'm going to do is put the argument here, say number. you can see this automatically highlights. It tells me that declaration must be compatible with recipient, which is the parent abstract class, is valid method, because this is valid method on our parent class doesn't have any arguments. But that said, I can put an argument as long as it's optional. If I by default make it null, then everything's fine. So you can have an argument as long as it's optional. The same goes if I had, let's say, this argument here, so number. If I save it, go back to the email recipient. Now, if I remove the null, it's absolutely fine. If I want to add another argument, I can, let's say, put name here. Again, as long as it's null, it's going to be fine. If it's not, it tells me again that it basically doesn't comply with the contract that we have in place. So I have to make it null by default. Okay, so if you have any arguments within the contract, you have to have them. If you don't, if you want to provide any within your implementation, they have to have some. They have to be basically optional, either null or any default value. So if I had, say, put number here and set it to 1, that's going to be fine as well. It doesn't have to be just null. It can be any default value. Basically, argument has to be optional, as we obviously read when we were going through the PHP documentation. Okay, but we don't need any argument. So I just wanted to show you how it works actually with these optional arguments. Okay, so we have our is valid, which is complying with the contract because of our contract does not have any arguments at all. It's public, it needs to be public. If I was to put this method protected, which I can also do, I'm still okay with the public. I would be fine with protected, but I won't be fine with private because, again, as we've discussed earlier, this is of more strict visibility than the one that's actually within our contract. Okay, so obviously for this specific exercise, we need public because we need to be able to access this method later on from outside of this class. So public function is valid. And again, let's add this doc block to our contract as well, to our abstract class above the abstract method. And let's do exactly the same. Obviously, we are extending here. We are fine with the text recipient. Our contract is obviously done here as well. So we all good with this recipient. But now if I go back to the notification class, you'll see this is no longer highlighted because we know that this contract, this abstract class actually needs to have this is valid because we've declared this abstract contract here, this method. So we know that this notification, whatever implementation we have, it will have this method declared. So that's why we are now safe to use it. Okay, and I'm going to add this doc block as well. Check if object is ready to deliver notification above this is valid inside of the notification class. So let's quickly have a look at what we have left. Our notification classes, recipient classes are all good. Let's go back to recipient. We can close this class. And now one thing, let's go back actually to this recipient. If this class was an abstract, then you wouldn't be able to declare abstract methods. It needs to be abstract class if you want to use abstract methods. Okay, so now we can close this recipient class. Now going back to our email, as you can see, we've reduced the duplicity to quite a minimum. We only have this deliver method now within the email, and the same is going to apply to the text class. But as you can see, we're still using the properties directly on the same instance of a class, which we now don't have. So what we need to do is replace this name with this recipient and then name. And the same goes for this recipient number. And what we could actually do is to, again, extract this part of the message to one of our recipient classes. So for text recipient, and for email recipient. And then to make sure that we have access to this method on the abstract class, let's just actually open this recipient again and let's declare the new method, abstract method, so that we know that this recipient classes which extended will definitely have this method available to us. So from within the recipient class, abstract, public, function, and what are we going to call it? Let's say name label, let's call it. Okay, and let's get this were mixed. It's going to be a string, So we return string get name label, because it also contains something else apart from our name. So now if we go back to the text recipient, for instance, you see this is automatically highlighted because it knows that we haven't actually implemented one of the methods that is required by this parent class. So let's quickly add it. And as we can see, we've got it down here now. Depends on what sort of IDE you use. You may have this auto-completion. Otherwise, you just retype the name of the method. But when you're actually creating the implementations, make sure you don't use the abstract name before the public and function. Abstract is only used to declare this contract, but not when you actually implement them. So going back to our text recipient, what this one had was recipient name and number, and that was within the bracket. So let's just get this out. First of all, let's go back to our text recipient, return, and we paste that in. Now, obviously, we don't refer to the separate object. We are referring directly to the properties on this instance of the object. So it's return this name, then space, and in between it brackets the number for this specific one. The same goes, obviously, now what we're going to do is use this recipient, and now we're going to get name label, because our IDE, if we go back to notification, knows that this recipient, whatever child extends this class, will have both of the method is valid and name label. They have to have it because they are declared as abstract on this abstract class. Okay, so that's text. And our text class is now done. You can see how much less code we have within this class. It's only a single method, a bit of a text, and then we delegate in the code the method on the recipient class. So we can close this text notification class, and let's go back. We can also close this text recipient class, because we're not going to be doing any more work on this one. We need to update our email recipient. Let's add this new implementation of the name label method. And if we go back to email, let's cut this name and then this email, return it from within this name, return name label, there we go. And that's now also completed. We can save it and close it, and from within our email class simply refer to this instance of the recipient and then name label method. And that's everything within the email notification class. Now, one thing, however, before we do anything, you can see that this deliver method is still highlighted within the notification class. And why is it highlighted? Because it doesn't know whether our child class, any class that will extend this notification class, will actually have this deliver method. There is no guarantee that it will have. And you might have already guessed, the one way that we can actually force it on any class that extends it, in our case would be the email or text, is to declare an abstract method with the same name from within our abstract class. So what we can do now is simply say abstract protected function deliver. And now have a look at this. This highlight is gone because we now know that if you want to extend this notification class, you have to have this deliver method implemented on it. So let's have a look at our email class. Let's just copy this doc block as well and paste it above this method. And everything works just fine. We don't have to change anything here because we already had this method implemented. If I was to remove it, basically commented in this case, you can see it's automatically telling me that it needs to have this method implemented, that there's going to be a trouble if you don't. So we uncomment it and everything goes back to where it was. So abstract methods from within the abstract classes allow us to declare contracts on any subclasses that extend them. Okay, let's now test it in a browser. Now, going back to our index.php file, as you can see, we need to change quite a few things here. We don't have now name and email available directly on the email class. So let's first create this recipient. So it's going to be, first of all, it's going to be email recipient equals new email recipient, and let's make sure that we have these classes available to us. So first of all, notification recipient is going to be the recipient, there we go, .php, and then we're gonna go for email recipient, and it's actually within the recipient directory. So let's just copy this quickly recipient, and then we go for email recipient, and then we're going to have text recipient as well, text recipient, and then we have email and text. Okay, so we have email recipient, and now these things go to the email recipient. I'm just going to quickly rename two of these variables. Okay, and then we will associate the instance of this email recipient with the email notification. So email recipient equals email recipient. So now this email recipient instance is associated with the recipient property on the email class. Same, we need to do the same for this text. So I'm just going to cut all this and start with text recipient equals new text recipient, and then let's rename the variable. There we go. And now let's associate it with our text notification. So text notification recipient property equals text recipient. And now we can send it. Okay, if we save it and preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. Exactly same result as before, but now we have far more flexible structure. If we go back to the editor, think about the fact that at any given time, your boss may come again and say, well, okay, we've got email and text, but we also need to provide, say, voice notification. Say we need to implement it. Well, you say, okay, no problem. I've got everything in place. All I need to do is just implement the classes that actually work with the whole system. So we've got email, as you can see, was very simple to implement. We only need deliver method. So let's quickly create the new class called voice, for instance. Voice. And this class will extend notification, and all I need to do is add the implementation of the deliver method, and the deliver method will simply return sending voice message to, and then on this recipient call name label. That's all we need to do. That's the only thing that we actually need to add, apart from the fact that obviously we need the recipient as well. But our class, the implementation of the class that actually delivers the message, that's all that it needs. Obviously, in the real life scenario, as I explained earlier, you wouldn't be returning string, you would be actually processing this message. So obviously this deliver methods will differ quite a lot, but it's all down to this method only, basically whatever's inside of this method that processes the request. Everything else is already in place. Our notification class has all these methods declared here. So it's got the property, which we know that it's going to we're gonna need before we actually will be able to send the message. It's got the send method, which is automatically available to us when we actually instantiate this voice class later on. The isValid and deliver method, which we obviously implement from within the voice class. So all this is done. Next thing we need to do is to create this recipient class. So voice recipient, and this class extends recipient, and we know we need to provide two method implementations. This one for voice recipient, we're going to have the same properties as text recipient. So it's going to be public name, which is going to be string, and then we're going to have public property called number, because when we send in the voice message, we're probably going to need the telephone number again. I'm going to use this as a declare this as string because it may have spaces there. And then isValid will simply check. Let's just copy whatever we have in a text message, and again we could extract this to another class perhaps later on, but for the time being, let's just keep it this way. Let's just keep it simple. So we have isValid already done, and then for name label, it's going to be return this. It's going to be name first, then concatenated within the brackets this number, and that's all. And that's job done. Now all I need to do, I can close all these classes. As you can see, I didn't have to modify any code that I've written before for the class notification or for the recipient. I didn't have to modify any of these classes. This stays exactly the same. Whereas before, if you had only this email class, you would first of all have to do some check before you send, whether it's, say, instance, whether you wanted to send email, text, or voice, and then if there was another method of notifying users, then you would have to compare against this. Every time the new notification method would be required, you would have to modify this email class. But now you have the whole structure where you only plug what you want, basically. So you create this voice, and let's use it within our index.php. I'm just going to actually duplicate everything that I have here, including this new line character. So duplicate this. Rather than text recipient, let's actually add this voice recipient as well. Here, voice recipient, and then voice after this as well. Voice, there we go. And now we can instantiate it. So voice recipient. Let's replace this variable name as well here with the voice recipient. There we go. And we can keep the same name and number, and that's, rather than text, it's going to be simply voice. And here what we're doing, it's going to be a voice notification. And let's remove these brackets. You can keep them, it doesn't hurt anyone, but if we don't have constructors, which we're going to be discussing soon, I tend to remove them, as I said earlier. Okay, save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and there we go, sending voice message. You see how quickly it was, how quick it was now that we have actually our component, notification component, you can call it, because it contains the entire structure for sending notifications of any type. You just basically create the implementation of the given notification, and you can plug it in automatically, because you only extend this notification class, and then your recipient class, which relates to your notification type, extends this recipient, needs to implement two methods, and job done. Now, one thing which we've obviously seen earlier, this text and voice recipient, they share pretty much everything. Everything here is the same. So what we could do instead is perhaps have it renamed, one of them, to phone recipient, and then just use it with whenever we actually call. If I open this index.php, we could only use this phone recipient, so rather than voice recipient and text recipient, phone recipient properties are the same. So obviously we can use it this way, or we could create another abstract class which extends recipient, and then these two, voice and text, would extend that class, because in PHP you can only extend one class, superclass, so you can't extend two classes. It can only be one. There is a way of providing shared functionality across different classes using traits, which we will discuss very shortly, but when you're extending classes, you can only extend one at a time. So let's quickly do this, rather than just having them two separate with basically, again, we duplicating the code, which we don't have to. Let's rename one of them to the phone recipient, and let's keep it this way. Let's rename the file as well. So it's a voice recipient. Let's rename it to phone recipient. And if we now remove this text recipient completely, let's go back to our index.php. Rather than having text recipient, let's rename this instantiation to a phone recipient, and the same goes recipient, and the same goes for this voice recipient. Both of them use the same instance of a class. These obviously don't exist anymore, we just rename it. And now if we save it, preview it in the browser, everything works exactly the same way. There's no point in having the classes with different names which have exactly same content, so that's why it's probably better to just have it as one and use it obviously with these two implementations of the notification class. So that's it in this video. In the following video we're going to discuss interfaces.